Before the British landed at Camy Bay, now called Botany Bay, the Darang Nation inhabited areas in Sydney, one of these being a suburb known as Redfern. During the 1920s, Indigenous Australians migrated from all around New South Wales to Redfern, with the hope of working on the railways. In the early 1970s, serious overcrowding developed, resulting in a group of Indigenous people squatting in empty houses in Redfern. In 1972, police arrested a group of alcoholic squatters who were then released to the care of Father Ted Kennedy at St Vincent's Church in Redfern. In 1973, the Aboriginal Housing Company formed and began purchasing land in Redfern with federal government grants. This has now become known as the Block. In an essay by Glota, he writes that when the first European missionaries arrived in Australia, they sought to convert the Indigenous people to their beliefs and practices. For the majority, the Indigenous way of life was seen as barbaric and primitive, and their religious ceremonies as pagan and evil. Over time, Indigenous people have constructed, as Glota points out, an Australian Aboriginal Christian theology, the aim of which, according to Rosendale, is to integrate the traditions of Aboriginal culture with the traditions of Christianity. As cited on the City of Sydney website, Father Ted Kennedy was involved with the affairs of intercity Aborigines since the 1970s, providing a service particularly to the Aboriginal people of Redfern through St Vincent's Catholic Church. While Father Ted was originally seen to be heading an activist parish, what he was actually doing was making his church open to Aboriginal people. He provided opportunities for Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people to get together to discuss issues. When Father Ted passed away in May 2005, Cardinal Pell replaced him with priests from the NCW, which is a worldwide religious organisation recognised by the head of the Catholic Church. Some see the way as being a blessing of the Spirit. Other individuals consider the way to be dangerous in doctrine and methodology, according to the Neo-Quechumenate. The article reports on the latest of a series of rows between the parishioners and the priest of St Vincent's in Redfern. After Father Ted's death, Cardinal Pell has appointed priests from the NCW to St Vincent's. The latest priest, Father Clesio Mendes, has been accused of disrespecting local Aborigines by scrubbing from an external wall of the church a line of poetry that has been there for years, which refers to an Aboriginal Christ. They also say he has removed a baptismal font sacred to the memory of the late Father Ted Kennedy. As cited by Austin, Rutherford claims, identity is never a static location. It contains traces of the past and what is to become. The Indigenous people have formed what Glota referred to, an Australian Aboriginal Christian theology, made up from their past and where they are located to now to form their project identity. Quoting from Malley, Father Clesio says, he cleaned the writing off the wall because it was critical of the church. For me, this is like graffiti, he said. Father Clesio said he was just trying to uphold the teachings of the church in the face of some parishioners who openly disrespected Catholic traditions. He cited the example of a woman who shared her consecrated communion wafer with an unconfirmed child, something forbidden in the church. Here, the priest and the parishioners are on opposing ends of a wide axis. Quoting again from Malley, Ralph Townsend, 52, an Aboriginal parishioner of about 18 years, said the proper Catholic way made Aboriginal locals nervous. When Father Ted was here, he ran the church to make Aboriginal people feel comfortable. And many of the parishioners are a product of diaspora. Some of their ancestors had been forced to move away from their original homes, and some had moved with the idea of a better life, where they had been relocated in Redfern. They still retain their collective memory of home and have been in the past and now alienated in their new home. Mr Townsend said, Mendes acts like it's his church, not the people's church. We just want to have a normal priest who is understanding towards Aboriginal people. Now the church in this case represents home to the parishioners. Over the years the parishioners have, and I'm quoting here from Austin, invested it with their personal meaning and associations to make it their home. To start, the classroom would be inviting to everyone, having a wide range of inclusive resources on display, available to all students. This article could lead to understandings of difference in many ways. To present ideas to a primary class using the event as curriculum as an educative experience, I would, firstly, as a lesson on understanding of how space becomes a home. The students would have a class discussion of places where they feel at home. I would explain to the students that this place does not need to be your house, but any location that evokes a loyalty to that place and helps form your identity. Next, the students would find pictures in magazines, photos, and use colours to create a collage of things that identify what is home to them. The students would then name their collage as a way of making their imagined space a home and write down 5 rules of how to behave in their imagined home. At the end of the lesson, students would share their homes with the class. Secondly, as a lesson on collective identities and how identity is formed, students would write down 10 things about themselves. For example, I play the piano, I like to cook, or I was not born in this town. I would then ask the students to write all of their identifiers on the board. Any repeated identifiers would be listed under each other. The students would then see which collective identities are larger, gaining a prominent position in their class, and which ones are smaller, and therefore may be marginalised. As a class, we would name each group. The students would then be divided into groups for each named collective group, and design a poster advertising their group. At the end of the lesson, they would share their posters with the class, promoting their collective identities, gaining an understanding that because one group may be smaller, it still forms a positive identity to those in it. Thirdly, as a lesson on the axis of identity, here the students would form groups. Each group would be given binary opposites. For example, one group would have boys, girls, and another could have youth, old age. Each group would list at least 5 positive attributes of each group and another 5 differences. The class would then discuss each group findings. I would ask the students if the differences were a deficit, prompting ways in which they could refocus on difference as a positive. Students would then prepare interview questions, as journalists interviewing an older member of the community, using questions such as, what makes you happy, or what is your favourite food? During the lesson, an older member of the community, a member with a perceived binary opposite, would come and be interviewed by the students. At the end of the lesson, when the visitors left, the class would discuss their interview, narrowing the axis between them and their visitor. The fourth idea would be one of diaspora. As a lesson, the students would write in their journals about a time when they felt like they were somewhere but wanted to return home. An example could be away on a school camp. I would explain to the students that the example does not necessarily need to be a negative experience, but one of being away from home and yet remembering home. Some students may like to mime or perform a role play in groups of how they felt in these situations. I would promote thinking by asking questions such as, how did you feel when you returned home? And did you retain memories of your time away from home, memories that made you want to return to that place? I would then use the example of my children supporting the All Blacks. Even though they are Australian, their father is a New Zealander. My children have a strong connection with Australia, but through stories and ties with New Zealand, they also consider New Zealand as home. I would promote thinking by asking questions such as, can people have 2 homes? And are my children wrong in supporting the All Blacks? Through these lessons, students will gain an understanding of issues and events in the community from the perspective of collective and individual identity, difference and diversity.